much for coming out on this cold night. We will try and do our best to connect the world of classical antiquity to New York City. And so on behalf of myself, Matt, and John, who are all going to be, we're going to kind of do a round robin. You're going to hear from each of us. We'd like to thank you all for coming, and also to Carol, Peter, and everyone here for asking us to come and speak about our new book. So tonight we're going to try and take you on a bit of a tour of classical New York, and we're going to highlight many of the buildings, works of art, and inscriptions that are discussed in the book. So obviously we're in the Skyscraper Museum, and skyscrapers are in many ways considered to be the kind of architectural form or idiom of New York City. And as you can see in our kind of opening slide and the references to Rockefeller Center, that skyscrapers do play a role in this book. In the fact that Rockefeller Center, its whole art program was largely driven by classical art and classical myth. Many of you know Atlas because he's on Fifth Avenue and he's opposite St. Patrick's Cathedral. But many of you, when I always say, oh, where's Prometheus? And unless you're paying attention, underneath the Christmas tree there is a golden god floating by who looks lovely. But of course that is Prometheus, the bringer of fire to man, who is kind of embodies technology and the positive benefits of technology. And one of our chapters in here by our contributor Jared Simard, who's a postdoc also at NYU, focuses on that artistic program. So in many ways we are going to touch on skyscrapers. John in particular is going to talk about them this evening. But what we really want to do tonight is kind of show you that the art, architecture, and epigraphic traditions of classical antiquity were essential reference points for the artists, architects, tastemakers, and patrons of New York City from the city's inception to the 20th century. Brilliant, everything's working. Okay, so what we're going to do is talk about buildings that engaged with the classical world. And that kind of means that they're in dialogue and exchange with classical antiquity. And this is what classicists like Matt and I call classical reception. And that broadly means kind of what individuals in a kind of post-antique contest, so basically once Rome has kind of fallen, how they engage and interact with antiquity. And why they reinterpret, appropriate, and kind of take the ideas, the language, the architectural and artistic forms of antiquity and reuse them. And so what I've shown here is just a couple of examples from some of the books that are talked about in the book, some of the buildings that are talked about in the book that we won't have time to go into detail tonight, just to give you kind of like a taster sampler, should you choose to take the book home with you this evening. So over here, does anyone know this building?
Grant's Tomb?
It's not Grant's Tomb.
Columbia.
No, it's not Columbia. It's in the Bronx. We got the Gould Memorial. We got.
It's not the library.
It's okay. Well, this is good. So this is good. Very good. I always like it when I turn out with a building that might get a few people. So this is the Gould Memorial Library, which is located on NYU's old Uptown campus, which is now part of Bronx Community College of the City University of New York. And what you can see here, this is a Stanford White designed building. Yes, and Columbia has a very similar building, lest you think McKim and Stanford White were at all competitive. They were, as were the universities, so some things don't change. But what is interesting, of course, is that this is modeled on the Parthenon, which is considered to be like the quintessential Roman building. But then this library, which is inside has a round rotunda, was really what anchored this new campus, and it was the grounding thing. So what we can see in the 1890s when this was built, that it was a critical building that you could look to and engage with. At the same time, we also see that ancient baths were critical to the reinterpretation of architecture in New York City. Now, everybody knows the old Penn Station, of course, which is modeled on the baths of Caracalla. At the same time, not everybody necessarily knows that Roman baths were also the inspiration for actual bath buildings in New York City. And so this is known today as the Asher Levy Baths on 23rd Street. Good, we got.
I knew that one.
Good, okay, very good. There will be a quiz later. So it's just important to know, and I would say then you can read more about these in different chapters in the book, but it's just an important thing to know that these kind of buildings are here in many different shapes and sizes. We can see 3 different types of buildings engaging with antiquity in various different ways. So it's just to give you a little bit of a sense. Now, since we're down here in Lower Manhattan, I wanted to start with buildings that were kind of around here. And I'm going to talk about here, and then John's going to go and talk about Foley Square, as well as some of the skyscrapers that engaged with classical forms. And then Matt's going to round us out this evening talking about the written word and the presence of Latin and English inscriptions on some of the buildings down in Lower Manhattan and throughout Manhattan. But you don't have to walk too far from here to find one of the most important buildings in all of New York City's history. This is the U.S. Customs House, better known today as Federal Hall National Memorial at 26 Wall Street. Now, if you want to go visit it, unfortunately you can't because of the federal shutdown. It's closed. It's a national park. But when the government reopens, if it ever reopens, I recommend a visit if you have not been. Now, this is the subject of the first chapter in our book, which Francis Moroney authored, but I want to talk a little bit about here because in a way it starts the conversation that will continue with what John and Matt are going to say tonight. So the first question is, in a way, why did the United States build a custom house in basically 1833 that looks like the Parthenon, a Greek temple that was built in Athens over 2,000 years previously? Now, the answer lies in the fact that at the start of the 19th century, the United States was a new nation. It was a nation in search of usable paths that could be appropriate, and classical antiquity offered such paths. So classical philology, literature, political theory, and history were central to the education that the Founding Fathers received, such as Thomas Jefferson, but also to the larger culture of the United States. So, for example, George Washington, when he was on campaign, showed his soldiers a play that was called Cincinnatus, that was about the Roman general Cincinnatus, who was a farmer, who went off to lead his soldiers, and he was given imperium, and he was a dictator, and then after he had finished the campaign successfully, gave up all of his power and went back to his farm. So the obvious parallels for Washington, of course, were noted later. And of course, the first veterans organization in the United States is called the Society of the Cincinnati. So we can also start to see where it's not only a function of elite culture, but it's really kind of core to all of American culture at this time. So it really pervades a lot of early American life. But as such, if you're a new nation, you need new buildings, just as you need new civic, financial institutions as well. And so immediately, Americans looked to antiquity. But at this junction in U.S. history, nobody had really traveled to Europe in huge numbers. It's very expensive. It takes a long time. So most of the way that Americans gained knowledge of antiquity was through publications, most notably through the Antiquities of Athens and Other Monuments of Greece, which was compiled by James Stewart and Nicholas Rivet. And this was a manuscript that circulated very widely. It was published between 1762 and 1816. And what you can see about it is it has beautiful illustrations. So we have the Parthenon here in its ruinous state, complete with a mosque built inside of it. But then we have also their reconstructions. So they are kind of helping architects, in a way, have a visual idea of what these buildings could look like. Now, of course, they're serving as mediators and interpreters. But the other thing that's important is that they have a lot of these schematic drawings. And at this point in U.S. history, there aren't many professional architects. The vast majority of people would maybe be more classified as builders. And so these templates, models with their very detailed measured drawings can really be used to create new buildings. Now, the Parthenon, of course, was a critical and obvious building to, in fact, allude to. It's the symbol of democracy and the apex of Greek civilization. It's built in the wake of the Persian Wars, a kind of a narrative that has become central to the construction of Western civilization, kind of the democratic Greeks fighting off the nasty aristocratic monarch Persian Empire. But that was something really Americans at that point also bought into and believed. So as a result, Americans wasted no time in appropriating the monument. So the first example of a Parthenon-esque building is actually in Philadelphia, the second bank of the United States, which was built between 1819 and 1824 by William Strickland. And in many ways, it symbolizes the strength and solidity of the bank and the banking system of the United States. So when Federal Hall was created, it was arguably the most, I'm going to call it Federal Hall just for ease, because that's what everybody knows it today, rather than the Custom House and have to explain back and forth. Fine. Okay, good. Sorry, just putting that caveat. It's like a big footnote. So when it was constructed, it was arguably the most important building outside of Washington, D.C. And it lies in the fact that, of course, customs duty was the primary source of revenue for the federal government. So in 1852, 95% of the federal government's revenue came from the port of New York. Let me start that again. 95% of government revenue came from customs duty. 75% of that came from New York City. So in other words, New York City was basically underwriting the federal government because there were no state taxes, no federal income taxes, none of that. So in a sense, this building can really, in a sense, embody the financial strength of New York City. The site, of course, was historically significant. As many of you probably know, it was where Washington was inaugurated in the old British City Hall, which then New Yorkers tore down. because why would we keep a historically significant building when we can build something else, like a row house, which was put on top. So in 1815, the Customs House was located in one of the houses on this site, and then decided in the early 1830s that it made sense, in fact, to have Town and Davis, the perhaps premier architectural form, or certainly one of the premier architectural forms, build a new building at this time. And the Secretary of the Treasury approved the design. Now, originally their design was to have a huge dome. Now, while the dome was retained, and this was a project where there were too many architects involved, it all came out well in the end, but there are 4 sets of people involved. I will not go into that tonight, but should you think of messy construction projects, this would be one of them, particularly when one architect went off with the plans. But you can see that there was originally intended to be a very big dome, which is still there today. But originally, this was to be large enough that it could be seen from the exterior. So here's what the dome looks like today, but obviously you can't see it. And that means that, of course, it really does look like a Parthenon building from the exterior, but that the interior is modified to function for the building. So as you know, there's a rotunda, and all the desks would have been arranged this way. So you would kind of come in and meet somebody here for your customs desk, pay your duty, and then go out and go about your way. But the Customs House was also not really an isolated example. Martin Euclid Thompson, I think when you have Euclid as your middle name, you probably have to become an architect, but it's an indication of the kind of milieu that people are living in if you have a very Greek middle name. Now, he built the Merchants Exchange between 1825 and 1827, and while it looks definitely much more like a Federalist-style building, it does have this nice tetrastyle portico here, and all of the Ionic capitals derive from the Temple of Athena Polas at Pyrene in Ionia, which is also illustrated in the Antiquities of Athens. So what we see is that all of these architects are reading similar publications, and they're taking the ideas and the forms and reinterpreting them into something highly original. Now, this burned down in the Great Fire of 1835, and then it was replaced by the Merchants Exchange. And what I think is, this is now Cipriani on Wall Street. So there's a second story that is up here, which is courtesy of McKim, Mead, and White. But you can start to see, again, the colonnades, the dome, and this playing. So what we start to see is architects interacting with classical forms, reinterpreting them, and putting them together in highly original ways. Now, one other building that embodies these types of exchanges from a slightly later period is the New York Stock Exchange. So this is finished in 1906 by George Post, who built City College, and actually his son had a seat on the New York Stock Exchange, which may have helped in getting the commission. Now, what's interesting to a Roman archaeologist, which is what my training is that you look at this and you go, who stuck a Corinthian temple on Wall Street? And obviously, it's a Corinthian. You can see these very detailed capitals. It's very, we'd say, frontal facing. But if you know about Corinthian buildings, you can see where it derives from. So this is the Maison Carrée. This is in the south of France. This is probably the most famous Corinthian temple in the entire Roman world. And the Corinthian order, while it is popular in the Greek world, it really reaches its apex under the Romans, because the first Roman emperor, Augustus, really adopts it as the kind of architectural order that he's going to use, is the whole Corinthian order. It's more expensive to produce, it's very luxurious, it's very grand. It also doesn't have any of the kind of baggage that the Romans saw between the Ionic and the Doric orders. So it's widely replicated throughout the whole Roman world. But you can also see some defining elements here, which is the fact that it's very frontal. It has a front, unlike Greek temples. It has a podium that it rests on as well. So we can really see that, oops, sorry, I got ahead of myself, in the New York Stock Exchange. But the other question is then, why the Corinthian order? Why these Roman orders at this particular moment in time? And it's important to know that, in the beginning part of the 19th century, Greece was all the rage. It symbolizes democracy. Of course, at that point, Greece was still, before the 1820s and 1830s, was still part of the Ottoman Empire. And so when they fight for their freedom and they become their own country, the Americans who fund them and send money see a kind of similar process of their own nation creation in the Greek state. So Greek architecture and Greek art is really essential. At the same time, Rome is considered to be the place of decline. It is tyrannical. People have read Gibbon, and so it's all going to go badly. It's also tyranny and all of that good stuff, which is what is not surprising when you see Thomas Cole's paintings, that this is the consumption of empire, and then it all goes really to hell in a handbasket, which, I mean, I know many of you have probably seen this at the New York Historical Society, but it seems to embody the attitudes towards Rome and Greece in the 1830s. But of course, by the time we get to the New York Stock Exchange, empire is good. I mean, the United States has an empire. It is a driving force. It is on the ascendancy. And so the rhetoric of decline is replaced by the rhetoric of exceptionalism, which, you know, is a very much an American thing. Like, we are immune from decline. We're great. We're fabulous. We'll all be good forever. Not that everyone believes that nowadays, but that was really something that was a key aspect of kind of the American psyche at this point in time. But what makes this even more interesting is we can see this architectural appropriation. We can see, of course, the colonnade here. The cella has been transformed into the floor. And yes, the steps have been removed and you can go in, but broadly it's the same. But what is very interesting is, in fact, the sculptural program, which I highly recommend walking around and looking at with binoculars if you've never done that. Has anyone done that? Okay, this audience is pretty good. Okay, good. So do you guys know who all the characters are? Oh, good, let's talk about the characters, because that's what makes it fun. Well, you've met the key, the lady in the center. This is Business Integrity, the whole group, which was created by Quincy Adam Ward and John Wayland Bartlett. It was entitled Business Integrity, Protecting the Industries of Man. Kind of interesting. So these are personifications, which are kind of a classical artistic device and form par excellence. And that's the kind of anthropomorphic form of ideas. It's like, let's make a city. You know, this Lady Liberty is the best example of this, perhaps. And the Romans have victory, they have cities that have personifications, and so on and so forth. So here we have business integrity. We can tell that she's business and she's trade-oriented because she's got these little wings on her hat, which Mercury always has, and Mercury's the god of commerce and the god of trade, and he's hanging out, of course, on the southern facade of Grand Central Terminal. But what's interesting is when you look in more detail, and I'm sorry, it's hard sometimes to get good pictures of this, we have these male figures here. He has got a lever, and there's a wheel behind him, and he has got his hand on a lever for electricity. So this is considered to be industry and electricity. So we have these figures here. Then we have two figures over here. They are looking at surveying, at maps, and have kind of surveying equipment. And so what we have on this side seems to be kind of industry, technology, and progress. On the other side, we have a man carrying this huge load of grain, and he's buried over. And next to him, we have a young woman who's got a kerchief. She's very modestly dressed, and she's got a ram right next to her. So there we've got agriculture. Over here, then, we seem to have people looking for stones and rocks, and so that would be mineral and exploitation. So in a sense, what we have right here is the entire US economy summarized. But who is providing the capital to finance the economy? Who is overseeing everything? Well, it's business integrity, or the New York Stock Exchange. Now, not only is the New York Stock Exchange, and this is its artistic and visual kind of rhetoric, not only is it helping these four sectors, but there are two children right here at her feet. So we got one on this side and one on this side. So not only are they going to, take care of the current economy, but this will provide for the future generations. Now, this, of course, might seem ironic at best to many of us in light of everything that's transpired in the last 10 or 11 years, particularly after the financial crisis. But what's interesting about it is, of course, is that this is how the New York Stock Exchange saw itself. That they saw themselves in this position, that they were providing capital, that they were helping the US economy, and that they were in some sense stewards of this. But that also required them to act with integrity, that there was some type of trust. Now, whether or not that's something we believe or not, or this is just very good PR, it's interesting that they chose to take these words and forms and present themselves that way to the public. And so, in kind of light of that, I would say we can see that the architecture of banks and exchanges and some customs houses were clearly engaged with the art and architecture of antiquity, but also in a way that these ideas were evolving. There's not a fixed antiquity that they're dealing with, but a multifaceted one. And so with that, I would say it's interesting now. I'm going to hand it over to John, who's going to talk about how these classical forms found expressions in the civic architecture of New York City at Foley Square and also in some of the skyscrapers. And so with that, I'm going to send you to John.
great, and thanks very much. Let me reiterate, of course, my thanks to Carol and Peter and the Skyscraper Museum for hosting us here, and also, in my case, to Lizzie and Matt for putting together this volume, editing it. I only contributed my part. They did all the work in terms of editing it, putting it together, working with the publisher, and I'm deeply grateful to the very lovely volume that you produced. So thank you, and for having me here tonight. So I'm an architectural historian and really an urban historian. My chapter is about the history of urban planning and the development, the kind of deployment of, in civic space, the deployment of the idea of the Greek agora or the Roman forum as a kind of civic space in revitalized kind of American cities in the late 19th and early 20th century, specifically around the idea of the civic center, which emerged in American cities from the 1890s up to the 1920s as a kind of strategy for symbolizing and implementing progressive political reforms in that kind of progressive era of the late 19th, early 20th century. And so in my chapter, in particular, I look at the development of Foley Square, which we'll look at a little bit more here, which is this area just north of City Hall Park. Here, right? So you have a number of courthouses, state and municipal and federal buildings all around this kind of space that is designed, as we'll see, to really function like a kind of forum, like a kind of public space, political civic space in the city, and it is characterized, of course, by highly classicizing buildings, as we'll see. And in particular, my chapter looks at the first building that was built here, which is planned from about 1910, but only finished after the intervention of World War I and a number of economic downturns, only finished in 1927. That's this building here, 60 Center Street, which is now originally county courthouse. And originally, this hexagonal building that we see here today, the original proposal was this, a kind of round-shaped building that was described by the New York Times and others to be like the Colosseum when it was unveiled in 1913. It was the winning entry in a competition for this new courthouse, this new county courthouse in 1912, 1913. And this, we'll come back to this highly classicizing building. And then, so that's what my chapter is about, the development of this kind of civic center idea, these kind of classical buildings and the classical spatial idea in American cities in this kind of early 20th century context. Being that we're in the Skyscraper Museum, however, I thought I would also end my presentation by speaking a little bit about skyscrapers, tall buildings, how they implement and appropriate classical forms, and both explicitly and implicitly. So I'll have a few things to say about that at the very end of my, I hope, 15 minutes. Okay, so, oops, went the wrong way. Okay, so, as I said, here is the Foley Square area that I focus on in my chapter. This highly cropped photograph looking sort of north on Center Street suggests, in fact, a kind of replication of a kind of Roman forum, complete with a number of buildings here, the original county courthouse, the later federal building, and the New York State building, all of which together present a kind of series of colonnades that enclose a kind of space in a way that, especially early 20th century architects and planners understood the Roman fora had done. And this grows out again of a larger context in American urban planning and municipal development of the so-called City Beautiful movement, which essentially grows out of especially the world's the Columbian Exposition of 1893 in Chicago. If you know it, I think I have an image of it coming up. But essentially, it developed into an idea whereby planners, politicians, and civic-minded sort of elites were committed to the idea that we should replicate a kind of civic space like the Forum, like the Agora in the American city, and that this would focus on, for example, in Cleveland, in St. Louis, in San Francisco, or in Chicago. Again, all of these projects of the first decade of the 20th century. They should all focus on the idea of a kind of landscape, an open space at the heart of the city, and that this should be surrounded by civic buildings. So in the case of Cleveland, the Civic Center plan of 1903, the first really and most fully conceived of these plans by Daniel Burnham, John Carrere, and others working in Cleveland to develop this plan. They indicated here that you would have a city hall, a courthouse, an auditorium, a public library, a federal building, and other municipal buildings. So a kind of complex of civic and cultural buildings that would surround a kind of rich, formalized, axial open space at the heart of the city. And this was about half built, in fact. I won't go into it deeply here, but if you know Cleveland and go there, you can see essentially this wing here and these two, the City Hall and the courthouse have been built, and you do get a sense when you're in that space of a kind of collection of classicizing, an ensemble of classicizing buildings. St. Louis didn't build its entire program as illustrated here, but again, in the report of 1904, the city committed itself to developing a system of libraries, courthouses, civic and public buildings, again, surrounding a kind of formalized open space. In San Francisco, the plan was developed again around 1912. I showed here an aerial photograph from 1945, which shows it really almost completely realized. And the San Francisco Civic Center is probably the most completely realized of these civic centers in the United States. We see here's the City Hall, the auditorium, State Building, Public Library, Opera House, War Memorial, and Federal Building, all again, and this space has been filled in further in the 21st century. So you really have a completely enclosed space of a kind of public civic center, or a kind of forum-like space that is characterized especially, you can see here the arcaded triple arched entry of the auditorium, the highly classicizing central portico, and cornice dominating the City Hall. And if we could look individually at these buildings, we would see a great number of, again, classical motifs filtered through Renaissance, essentially, classicism, right? And then just to remind you that in Daniel Burnham's kind of pioneering City Beautiful document of the plan of Chicago, he had anticipated a new massively tall city hall at the center of a kind of civic space characterized again by these classicizing buildings. And these were all, again, elements of what's called the City Beautiful movement, which again emerged out of an idea of again, monumentalizing American cities through infrastructure, public buildings, and public works, very much influenced by the ability now in the 20th century, or the late 19th century, to do what Lizzie was pointing out earlier architects could not do, right? In the early 19th century, American architects, American builders did not have access to go to Europe. With the rise of steam travel and technology in the later 19th century, the first generations of American architects do travel abroad, and they're heavily impressed by what they see in Rome, and especially in Paris, which had been redeveloped by Haussmann in this very heavily classicizing monumental mode of uniform street facades and classicizing features to give a sense of kind of empire. And again, in this moment of the late 19th century, you have the sense, as Lizzie pointed out, of a kind of American imperial identity, this idea that we are the new Rome as opposed to the new Greece, and this idea, especially with the development of the literal colonial holdings after the Spanish-American War, right, where the United States becomes the possessor of the Philippines, of Cuba, of some other South Pacific territories, right, so the United States becomes not a colony but a colonizer. And then, of course, coupled with the American economic mastery, right, of the late 19th, early 20th century of industrial development, you certainly have this kind of public sense that the United States is the new empire, right? So this Roman imperial mode of modernization is apt. So in New York, I'm sorry, I've gone the wrong way again. So again, just a few more examples of where this comes from. Of course, the idea of the Roman Forum itself as a kind of, and I think you'll see the kind of family resemblance here, of a kind of series of classicizing arcaded portico buildings that surround and define a kind of open central space in places like the Roman Forum, or even more systematically in the fora of every Roman colonial town, right? And again, it goes back in the American context to the idea of the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago, in which a number of architects worked together to establish a kind of uniform cornice line, uniform classical idiom and motifs, again, based on Roman models of, again, the uniform cornice, the central domed administration building of Richard Morris Hunt, one of the first American architects to be trained in Paris at the École des Beaux-Arts, and the series of colonnades and arcades that define this kind of, again, ensemble of classicizing buildings that serve to define a kind of central open space. Now, in this case, it was a lagoon that opened onto Lake Michigan, so a kind of water feature, but this is translated in American Civic Center designs later in Washington, D.C., with its axial central mall and classicizing buildings that define the space of that mall, or again in the examples I showed you before of Cleveland, St. Louis, or San Francisco, again this idea of a kind of formalized axial central landscape feature, right, that is defined and presented in a way by the ensemble of classicizing buildings that shape that space. So this became clearly a kind of movement in American cities, American municipal planning in the early 20th century, and in my chapter, I trace this history and then come back to New York to look at the way essentially we had, again, the arrival of this Colosseum-like county courthouse in 1913. The context in New York, briefly, is that as early as 1904, 1907, the city had impaneled a kind of civic improvement commission to look at not only what other cities were doing, what was happening in Europe, but ways that New York City could improve its infrastructure, its arterial connections, and its kind of monumental form, right? How it could develop things like this, a kind of civic center for Brooklyn at the site of Borough Hall. The proposal, never built, but the proposal was to redevelop this space around a kind of central again, axial sort of space with a crowning column in the center and a reorganized series of Borough Hall, library, Brooklyn Academy of Music, etc. in the space, and then radiating out from it a number of parkways that would lead out into other parts of Brooklyn and then across bridges into Manhattan. So certainly here you have a sense of the relationship to Olmsted's idea about incorporating landscape into the city through parkways and boulevards, but now with this idea of this kind of monumental classicism, clearly filtered through a kind of Baroque precedent of Rome and the idea of papal Rome with its many central round points and vertical features of columns and Cleopatra's Egyptian needles and things like this that mark the spaces of these public plazas in Rome. And again, it is this generation of American architects and elites traveling now across the Atlantic to see Rome, to see Paris, who are inspired to remake American cities in this sort of image of an imperial idiom, right? And so you see early plans in New York to perhaps do this by clearing away the buildings in City Hall Park. So this was a plan of 1903. Where the so-called Tweed Courthouse, now the Board of Education, would be removed. Also the rather offensive to many at that time post office. This was eventually removed from this site in 1936, but the idea was to clear away City Hall Park of everything but the original City Hall and establish a row, it's difficult to see here, but a row of kind of uniform facades here to house municipal administration. And this was before the final municipal building was designed, but you can see here a proposal for sort of a Campanile-like, again, Venetian Renaissance classicism as an image of this, again, imperial image of New York. You can see here that in 1922, the building that I look at, this round Colosseum-like courthouse had in fact shifted to the hexagonal building that we see today for a number of reasons, having to do with budget, having to do with the footings, the foundations, the possibility of really not building this building. But you can see that by 1922, still the idea for Foley Square was this idea of a kind of Roman or Greek-like civic space that is defined by a uniform cornice line of classicizing buildings with colonnades and porticos in this sort of classical sense. And this was still clearly the kind of image of what this City Beautiful Civic Center might be in the American city. So then again, in my article, and I won't go into much more deeply than this, but just to say that this architect from Boston, Guy Lowell, wins the competition in 1913 with this proposal. So again, you can see with the sort of the four, it's symmetrical about a round center, so it has porticos on all four sides. It was meant to expand over Center Street and have streetcars running underneath it. This obviously continuous colonnade here and a number of multiple cornices, make that classical connection rather explicit. This is in fact a very tall building. It was meant to be 12 or 13 stories, but the continuous colonnade give it a kind of horizontal sense of spread out over space, which is a point I want to take up later. Again, for various reasons, it's eventually converted to the hexagonal building here that we have, and then later the Civic Center is filled in with, again, federal, state, municipal, and federal buildings and courthouses there to create a kind of, in a way, it doesn't have the fully integrated classical idiom of the original kind of plan like this, or as we saw perhaps in Cleveland, but nonetheless, there is a sense there, I think, if you go there, and of course one rarely goes there unless maybe you have jury duty or something like that, but if you go into Foley Square, I think if you look around, you do have a sense of this, what it was intended to be in terms of this collection of classicizing buildings that create this sense of a kind of civic forum or a civic kind of space. So let me finish my points then by kind of contrasting this idea of a kind of civic, horizontal, open landscape with the, certainly here in the Skyscraper Museum, perhaps more familiar 20th century or late 19th century idiom of the tall building, right? And typically, of course, we can see looking around the exhibit here, we can see there are quite a number of classicizing approaches to the skyscraper, right? right? And it's something that we talked a little bit about in the book. Jared has his chapter about Rockefeller Center, and he talks about the kind of grouping of those buildings to create a kind of forum-like space in the City Beautiful idiom. But we don't really take it a lot farther than that. So here I thought I might hazard a few comments about the development of the skyscraper form within the context of classicism, since we're here in the Skyscraper Museum today. So this isn't really stuff that's in the book, but it's just some thoughts that I had developed for the presentation tonight. So a real distinction between this sort of mode of landscape, of civic center, and the early tall building, of course, is the idea of, I'd say, horizontality as opposed to verticality, right? The major characteristic of the early skyscrapers is their soaring verticality. And of course, architects take often the classical ideal of the column as an inspiration. So we often see, for example, with the Equitable building, the idea of a kind of tripartite division, like a column, like a human body, divided into the three parts, the base, the shaft, and the capital, where each of these zones also represents a different function often, right? Different uses correlate with the different zones of the building. You can also see, of course, a lot of classicizing detail, right? Pilasters, massive barrel vaulted entry, and then big, arched entry and a big barrel vaulted interior lobby if you've ever been in. If you haven't, I suggest you do. And then rising up a kind of a rather undecorated middle section or shaft of the capital, if you will, but then a return to explicit classical ornamentation in the top part with its cornices, and it's the return of pilasters, etc. here. So you certainly have a sense that early architects of the tall building were certainly looking at how to deploy some of those, again, classical features that Lizzie was talking about, again, in order to represent some of the symbolic associations, both with empire, but also more, I think for architects, there are the associations with logic, order, proportion, and ratio that come out of the Greek and Roman systems of the orders. So I think for architects to think about this new building type under the kind of logic or rigor of the classical system was something that they were eager to do. Certainly, and given the time's running short, I'll just skip the municipal building for now, but I think certainly someone like Bruce Price is certainly thinking about how he can develop this massively tall new building type, in 1895, the American Surety Company, develop it with classicizing principles of, again, ratio, scale, proportion, and order, again, developing the tripartite system, again, the idea of the column, the kind of, but as I think I learned here in the Skyscraper Museum, in fact, he was thinking actually more about the pilaster, right? The flatness of the facades and the way that the windows could act as the flutes in the pilaster. And we see, this is especially appropriate here for a building that is really experimenting with the thinness of that facade over the metal frame. And again, here in this museum, the model's around the corner here. If you came to the 10 and taller exhibition, or here in Skyscraper, I think there's a lot of information here about Price's development of this curtain wall, right? This very thin enclosure of the building. And he's clearly thinking literally about classical ornamentation, right? So we see the massive colonnade here. We see the Atlantid figures here, definite quotation to Greek archaeology. We see certainly the idea of the cornices and the pilasters. So not only do we see the explicit sort of symbolic references to specific elements, but then overall we see a kind of system of classical order, form, and proportion that these architects are developing. Here in the early tall buildings. And looking around this room, you can see multiple examples of these buildings that deploy these classical elements within the idea of the tall building. Oh, these are both on Broadway. If you don't know them, sorry. This one is they're both above Wall Street. This is at Pine Street, Broadway and Pine, just really diagonal. This picture was probably, would have been taken or conceived of from the Trinity Church graveyard there. This is 120 Broadway, exactly right. And this is just across the street. So this is this site here, actually. This is a picture taken before 1912. This was the earlier Equitable building that was on this site until 1912, and then it was replaced by this building. So these are literally across the street from each other, two very iconic, early examples of tall buildings that are utilizing classical forms and details, again, to provide this image. Again, not, I would say, things that these buildings are striving for, right? Permanence, legitimacy, prosperity, again with the Wall Street Bank, right? The stock exchange is playing on those symbolic references largely to inspire confidence, right? In 1908, in recent memory, we'd seen boom and bust many times on Wall Street in the early 1890s. In 1907, you see the run on banks. So certainly the idea that you're going to build in this permanent, stable, timeless way of the classical idiom is a way to inspire a kind of confidence in the public, right? So I think that's part of what's happening here. But also, again, I think for architects in particular, there's this deep engagement with classical form, and that's, I think, what you were talking about, the way the classicists are committed kind of devotees of this field and its internal logic and systematic practice, right, that these architects are engaged with. And again, you could look around, the postcards, the images here to see lots of examples of this from the 10 and taller. If we just look at two examples that are located near where the Civic Center is, we would see, for example, this building is still standing, the Jones building of 1899, just here, where again, we can see a kind of classical reference in the arcades, the cornices, the rustication, like a Roman wall, the kind of portico here. So certainly you have this sense that the classical was a common clothing or a common idiom for these kind of commercial loft buildings, or this one over here, the Metropolitan Life Insurance building, which faces on Broadway, but the annex of which would have been located over here near where the Civic Center is eventually built. So certainly that one use of classicism that we often think of, right? The literal archaeological reference to the column, the wall, the arch, the barrel vault. So these things that say to us Rome, that symbolize Rome, right? But I would say, and this is where I'll jump even further beyond where the book kind of ends, right? And think about modern and postmodern architecture too, because there also, I think, we see a different appropriation of classicism, right? One in which is more about the forms, about the orders, about the mass and the ratio and the scale, rather than the explicit historicism, right? So what modernism does is it discards historicism, right? It says that this symbolic reference is beside the point, that in fact these are all, right, steel-framed buildings. They are not masonry buildings. These are not Roman buildings that are held up by the stones. In fact, this is just a simple cladding that's placed over the steel frame. And that could be said about any of these buildings that I'm talking about, these two, right? So this is clearly, these are not Roman technology. These are modern steel frame technology. So the modernist architects of the 20th century, of course, will discard the historical reference, but I think we can still see within their approach something of the idea of the logic, the order, the scale, and the mass. And so with Mies, for example, very famously here at the Illinois Institute of Technology, where he goes and becomes the director after leaving the Bauhaus, right after leaving Germany, like Gropius at Harvard, right? He comes to direct this major new architecture school here in Chicago. And so he develops a campus of these modernist, purely abstract, non-historicizing buildings. We see purely the steel and the glass. It creates kind of cube of remarkable space within. But we also might discern something of a reference to the Greek colonnade, right? In these trusses, right? This sense of this rhythm that he establishes of the structure, just like the trabeation of the Roman colonnade. It's a system of structure that holds up the roof, right? And encloses the space. Likewise here, you have these external trusses that create this rhythm. You have a counter rhythm of the windows, and you begin to see that he also might be engaging with the system of classical order, proportion, ratio, and scale in a way that relates to the form and the experience of the building, not necessarily to the literal archaeological references of the elements, right? And likewise here in New York, the Seagram, where when we go up on that plaza, it's almost like you're entering into a Greek temenos, right? A kind of sacred space removed from the city. We enter up those stairs and we're in this kind of precinct that is distinct from the block and lot system of everything around it. And then you're confronted also with something that might recall a kind of colonnade, a kind of Greek temple on top of this space here, okay? So again, I think that the classical is present, even though we might not discern it explicitly in the references that we're so familiar with. I mean, these classical references are all around us in New York. And just closer to home, if we're thinking about this neighborhood, the example might be Chase Plaza, where again you see this colonnade of the structure-bearing piers that are held to the exterior of the building, which of course structurally allow the wide open spans of the interior. But even on the interior, you might get a sense, walking around here, that you're within and among the colonnade of the Greek temple, right? That you are, like the Greeks, enclosed by and protected by and sheltered by this kind of structural system that creates a rhythm of space. And so here, this is perhaps not so far from the idea of the Greek and Roman architectural forms as we might think when we look at their pure abstract kind of crystalline modernist form, right? So lurking there might be something, right? And we might even say further here, if you put this building together with Brown Brothers and US Steel, as you go around the block, we might see this collection of buildings in a space that isn't so unlike the space of a Greek temenos with its irregular placements of buildings off axis, so you create these kind of visual refractions of space. Okay, so again, if I had more time, we'd go into that further. And then finally, I'll just finish by, the return of symbolism, right? The return of history, right? Postmodernism in New York. Again, something we don't touch in the book, maybe chapter 2, maybe here at the Skyscraper Museum. We might think about classicism in the postmodern world. Actually, you've touched on this, I think, in some of your exhibitions. But here we might see again the way that Philip Johnson brings back the idea of the broken pediment. Again, the classical now filtered through the Baroque, right? And the kind of certainly the massive enclosed barrel vaulted interior and its arched portico, right? Or here, Aldo Rossi's scholastic building, a posthumous creation of his design, where again we certainly see the return of trabeation, of a kind of stripped down, spare Greek form, not unlike the modernist ones I was showing before, with a little bit more attention to context relating to these more historicizing buildings on Broadway. The rusticated pilasters, et cetera, of the surrounding buildings here are carried forward in an abstracted way, but one that still suggests the presence of the past, right? The presence of that classical form around us here in New York. So again, please. That's relatively new, yeah, 2001. Yeah, if you know it on Broadway there, yeah. It's, it looks like almost an erector set. It's deceptively simple in a way. If you look at the back side on Crosby Street, I think it is, and it's very different and more Roman, in fact, arcaded facade on the rear. So these last two slides are things we don't talk about in the book, but I encourage you to think about them, or maybe the question and answer we could talk about it more. Maybe we could do volume 2. Yeah, that's, like I went over a little bit. I'm sorry about that, but that's, yeah, so, okay.
Well, thank you, John. I think that leads into a perfect transition.
Fantastic.
Because I am not going to take too much of your time. I come here in the spirit of conversation. And so much interesting stuff has been said already that I want to start talking about it. I've already learned a lot from my colleagues, and I'm just going to go back, and I hope I know how to do this, to that last building, which actually is in the book.
You're right, it is.
In fact, we have a bit on reflections at the end of the volume, in which we think about other ways in which this problem of classical New York could be approached. And this building with its broken pediment is in fact mentioned as a kind of potential source or subject for exploration. And so, yeah, volume 2, John, obviously. So anyway, I want to say what my colleagues have said. Thank you. Thank you for inviting us. This has been such a fun project. I was talking to my wife the other day about the book and what one feels one has accomplished when it comes out. You want to make a contribution to scholarship, maybe make an impact, exert some influence on the conversation, if you will. But I noted how even in the space of 3 or 4 months since the book has been out, how much it has influenced me, exposed me to so many different things that I hadn't in the past had access to, like the Skyscraper Museum. This is really a great pleasure for me to be here, not merely for what John says about the classical forms lurking underneath, if you can only look hard enough, but because it's such an interesting idea for a museum and utterly compelling in the city of New York, which is, we note, in fact, in the book, the quintessential modern metropolis, often defined, as I say, and I'm quoting here, by the skyscrapers that came to dominate its skyline, which is topical for the current exhibition here. So thank you for the invitation. I'm going to be talking about words and how they interact with space in my little bit on inscriptions, which are words inscribed on buildings, monuments, stones of any kind. And as I say, I come here in the spirit of conversation, but I'd like to point out 2 things in particular. One is contained in my title, which I've there. This idea of permanence, which has been alluded to already by our first 2 speakers, that a lot of the motivation behind overt classicizing and perhaps less overt classicizing is this idea for permanence. Classical period, even the Egyptian period before it suggested a kind of permanence that, for obvious reasons, human beings of every stripe are invested in some way, because an awareness of our own lack of permanence, I think. And the second thing I'd like to talk about, which is really personal, and in fact, I think motivates a lot of what I do in my scholarship, and I think Carol was very, very right when she said, it's interesting to see what classicists are doing these days. We're not limited to our previously narrowly circumscribed purview of the classical period from the, and maybe depending on how far you go back, if you start with literature with Homer in the 8th century BC up to Apuleius in the end of the 2nd century AD, that was it, okay? You've got a millennium of literature, classical period, circumscribed, done, okay? Now we've been forced, as it were, receding from the center, you might say, of the conversation in the academy. Many of our academic institutions were founded on classical models and had the study of Greek and Latin as languages, the study of the heritage of Greece and Rome at the center of the curriculum. Now we're sort of forced to fight for resources with an increasingly democratic university system. We've been forced to articulate why it is that we matter. And I think if we've done anything here, I can tell, and perhaps I'm an easy target here, we're making that case. And I think the language of compulsion to be forced is actually right. But it's also something that I had noticed even as a boy walking through the city of New York, beginning to study Latin at 13, how casual the encounter with the classical past was. Even my school, which is a classicizing building on the Upper East Side, reminded me of how ever-present, in fact, the classics were, and how relatively easy it is in this city to encounter them. And speaking of encounters and permanence, this lecture, indeed my chapter in the book, quotes one of the great minds of the 18th century, England, Samuel Johnson, who reflected on the proper language for an epitaph, that is, to commemorate the dead. And in this case, he was thinking about his friend Oliver Goldsmith, who was the Irish polymath, historian, poet, playwright, whose epitaph Johnson wrote, in fact, composed in Latin. And justifying the Latin of his composition with this, saying that the language of the country of which a learned man was a native is not the language fit for his epitaph, which should be in ancient and permanent language. Everything intended to be universal and permanent should be in Latin. Boswell, who wrote The Life of Johnson, which is just a pleasure to read at any point. You can crack it open and find something funny, usually, said, for his part, I think it would be best to have epitaphs written in both in a learned language, namely Latin, and in the language of the country, so that they might have the advantage of being more universally understood, and at the same time secured of classical stability. This is typical of Johnson. This is typical of Boswell wanting it both ways. Right? Johnson committed to the classical, Boswell wanting both English and Latin. And indeed, for many of us walking through the city, the notion of comprehensibility, so being able to understand what we read, is still an issue, because so many of the Latin inscriptions that we encounter throughout the city are left untranslated. I start with this one, which is in Central Park, which is the Waldo Hutchins Memorial Bench, which was erected in 1932. Plans for its Placement in the park. This is on East 72nd Street at the entrance there. Some of you may know it. Very handsome area. It was a good 10 years in the making. Hutchins himself was a state assemblyman, a U.S. congressman, and perhaps most importantly for Central Park, one of the founding members of the Central Park Conservancy, and also a vital member there. His son, whose name was, of course, Augustus, a lawyer himself, advocated for getting his father a personal monument, which is no longer possible. I went through the records down just not far from City Hall. They're across the street. They used to be in the attic of City Hall. Now they're across the street in a building on Broadway. I went through the records, and in fact, one of the last personal monuments in the park was 1943. So this is getting there. And that one, too, is inscribed with a classical quotation, this time in Greek. But this is Latin from the Roman Stoic philosopher Seneca. And there is no translation. However, alteri vivas oportet si vis tibi vivere means you must live for another if you wish to live for yourself. Fitting, I should say, for a member of the New York community so committed to public service in the state, in the federal, and actually in the city itself. I want to talk about, here's a handsome sundial, which is one of the earliest works, the sculpture there of Paul Manship. Also adorned with a Latin inscription on the back, quoting Horace probably, or alluding to Horace, ne diruator fuga temporum, let it not be destroyed by the flight of time, probably the memory of Waldo Hutchins. And there I have the Roman quotation from which it comes. And there's another image of it. Really, it sits atop the bench. It's a handsome piece, probably representative of one of the Greek goddesses of time, the Horai. There she is, lighting up the sundial. I wanted to talk about, since we're downtown, and I'll say a little bit about this monument, and then one other thing, and then we can open up the conversation. I, of course, have a million slides because I just can't cut things down. You will recognize this. We've talked a bit about this area of New York already. Broadway, this is the sort of rural chapel to Trinity Church, part of Trinity Church Parish, on Broadway between Fulton and Vesey, which is apparently the oldest surviving church building in New York and perhaps even the country. In any case, in New York, quoting an important building in an important church in London, St. Martin in the Fields, if I'm not mistaken. But in any case, what's important for our purposes is to see that this, let me see, there it is. Many of you might recognize this monument there in the middle, which is I hear people saying, this is a learned audience, very nice, the Montgomery Monument, there it is, which is the first monument commissioned by our fledgling country in January of 1776. That is to say, it was made in 77, but it was commissioned in 76, right after the death of Richard Montgomery, who was himself an officer in the British Army. He then came to serve in the Continental Army, and at the Siege of Quebec on New Year's Eve died. And within 3 weeks of his death, the Continental Congress had decreed that he was worthy of a monument. They sent this commission to Paris, where it was put in the hands of the ambassador in Paris, who is, of course, one of the most famous Americans, whose name escapes me right now, Franklin, who was hanging out in the right circles, of course, and knew, or at least was able to get a commission of the royal sculptor, whose name was Caffieri, Jean-Jacques Caffieri, Sculptor Regius, which means royal sculptor, who in fact sculpted it and had it sent originally to Philadelphia, and it was supposed to be in Philadelphia. It was only about 10 years later, in 1787, that it was actually set up here in the facade of St. Paul's. What's important for our purposes, beyond the sculpture itself, is the quotation and the Latin "Libertas Restituta," which is a clarion call of the tyrannicides who assassinated Julius Caesar. It was also revived among in the first century AD after the assassination of Nero, and so it was a very pregnant political formula in ancient Rome that is being used by this fledgling nation. 1776-77, it was still very much in doubt who was going to win, and you see all sorts of symbolism in the decoration here. You have the Club of Hercules. Hercules was associated with the power of France, breaking the chains, the yoke, I guess I can use this pointer here, of British tyranny. You have this ancient Roman symbol of freedom in the pileus, which was a cap worn by manumitted slaves. You have also other martial images over here. You have the palm of victory, also a very familiar Roman symbol. So this is the very first national monument, very overtly classicizing, quoting classical precedents. I want to move, and now I'm going to go through about 1 million different slides here. I feel I'm like ancient ritual in that guide. This is just a teaser for you to pick up the book, right? It's all in there. But this is the great Goodhue Monument. There actually is the Goldsmith Monument in Poets' Corner in London. But I want to get, here, to more recent encounters, if we're talking about the classical encounter. This is a mosaic in glass primarily, under Bryant Park, right, at 42nd Street and 6th Avenue, the site of the F train, the D and the B, and so forth. And the passageway to the 7th Avenue subway. And you can see that Sam Kuntz, who's a Brooklyn-based mosaicist, uses Latin, gutta cavat lapidem, in order to sort of capture, I think, the struggle of building something underground where the force of nature is always trying to impose itself, and water can be found very frequently. And so that's a 2002 mosaic. Oh, excuse me. But I'd like to close here with another encounter from the 9/11 Memorial and Museum. This is the final spot in the museum, the end, as it were, of the experience, because it is that harrowing and in its richness. We have a quotation of the Latin poet Virgil, the quintessential epic poet, the poet of empire, in this absolutely extraordinary work of art. The quotation is made from bronze recovered from the site, and the blue background invokes at once the crystal clear blue sky of that September morning, as well as the many, many posters and flyers that went up all over the city looking for lost ones. And there are as many little index cards size blues as there blue squares as there are deceased. But for our purposes, I want to look at the quotation, which is "No day shall erase you from the memory of time," which comes from the 9th book of Virgil's Aeneid, which commemorates the memory of 2 soldiers in the Trojan camp. Now the Trojans have besieged, have come to Italy and have been engaged now in a war with the indigenous Italians. This is the story of the foundation of Rome. In any case, these 2 warriors, who are depicted as lovers, homoerotic lovers, go out at night under the cover of darkness and murder the local Italians in their sleep, overcome many of them with wine, and are only undone, they're about to get away with this murder, by the booty that they take with them, in particular the young one, who's betrayed by the gleam of the bronze that he has stolen in the moonlight. And the local Italians see them running through the night, and they stop them, and they kill the young one. And then the older one, his lover, gives himself up, and the 2 die. And Virgil writes, "Nulla dies unquam memory vos eximet aevo." No day shall erase you from the memory of time. And it was in 2011 when Caroline Alexander, a translator of Virgil and Homer, and a classicist now, an independent scholar, wrote an op-ed for the New York Times saying how inappropriate this quotation was. If only those who had used it had consulted with her, or with me, or with Virgil, with the Virgilian text, they would have understood the context to be inappropriate. And so, in the spirit of contemporaneousness, I would bring this op-ed into my students after having read this passage and said, "Well, what do you think?" And the students say, "Well, no, I think it, accurately captures what so many of us felt and experienced on that day and subsequently, and that it's a fitting quotation." I said, "Well, what about the context, students? The context, shouldn't we be?" And then it occurred to me that, in fact, when one divorces quotations or words from their context, they take on new meaning in other contexts. And in fact, this gets to the heart, I think, of what quoting classical forms, quoting classical texts really is about. It's revivifying, not merely the ancient works, using them to construct a kind of identity or capture a feeling or a sentiment, but they also imbue the context in which they are found, the new context, with a different meaning. And I think it's the kind of universality, really, of classical culture that made the Virgilian quotation so attractive. It was non-denominational in that sense. It didn't come from the Christian or Hebrew Bible, from the Quran, or for any other contemporary religious text, but rather from the classical past, which belongs to no one and thus to everyone, and thus serves as a fitting, I think, quotation. And so I have been convinced by my students that they're right, and that words can have new meanings and contexts change. And it's that process of change that we, as scholars dedicated to understanding classical reception, are committed to. So thank you. I'm happy to open up the floor for questions if anybody has them. And I'm sure I speak on behalf of my colleagues when I say that too.
Yeah,
So,
Other questions? Here you go. Go ahead.
Do any buildings built since 1950 have Latin inscriptions on them?
oh yes. Buildings. That's interesting. Certainly monuments, mosaics.
Not a monument. a building.
Yeah, a building. That's a good question.
That's a trick question.
Right.
No, I know.
I'm sure some of the postmodernists would have used, yeah, I'm thinking of the Piazza d'Italia, I think, has some Latin in New Orleans, but it's a good question. Yeah.
Maybe
Do
they
some
need to
research,
start
yeah,
doing it.
think about this, right, yeah.
Yeah, I've tracked down a whole host of, as it were, more recent Latin quotations on different places. You can see sometimes on the pavement the old Roman inscription "Cave Canem," which we know from Pompeii, "Beware the dog," which is sort of tongue-in-cheek, humorous. And maybe not necessarily there to invoke permanence as much as humor, but that's a great question. In fact, it's a question I'm going to have to answer because as a follow-up to this book, I'm putting out with the press a little book that's going to cover all the Greek and Latin inscriptions in the city of New York with Fordham University Press. Because in doing this little article, I collected over 100 inscriptions. And there are only about 9 of them that I talk about. Well, maybe more than that, but about 20 that I talk about in the chapter.
Could you speak a little bit about the genesis of the book? How did it come together? It was your idea together?
Well, it started with Matt and I kind of started. So Matt was president of the New York Classical Club, and they have a winter conference, which, should you like to go, it's this weekend on Greek vases.
Yeah.
And we were both doing similar type of work when I was working on buildings and you were working on inscriptions, and you kind of organized the conference, and John was the speaker, and some of the other contributors were speakers because we kind of realized it was all around us. But for all of the interest in the appropriation of classical forms and ideas, nobody had really worked on it in New York. Like Philadelphia, a lot of people. Chicago, lots of people. But New York was kind of this thing, and so I think for us as classicists of different training and backgrounds who were interested in it, it was a great opportunity to, again, as you like through kind of to expand ourselves, and both of us being, teaching students about classical buildings, classical ideas through the kind of forms of New York City, thought it was a great idea to do it. And then the conference was really successful, and then we pulled in a few more essays, and that's what happened.
Yeah, and the conference was called Classical New York.
Yeah.
When I walk past some of the older NYU buildings, I see university with a V.
Right.
Is that just a nod to classicism?
University with a
The V.
Well, you mean the U is...
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah,
right.
yeah.
Oh,
It has to do with...
yeah.
It does.
That's a kind of an error that I think is taken on, but it does come from the technology of carving, right?
It does, and it also specifically, at least in the case of the Gould Memorial Library, Stanford White specifically references in a letter that he was looking at the Forum of Trajan and looking at the font.
Right.
So it is part of that, but it's also interesting that even down to kind of the way the letters are carved, there are certain people really paying attention to that, and that kind of quality of engagement is almost obsessive. And so yes, that's exactly why it translates. That's also why we spend lots of time trying to do the math with the Roman numerals on so many buildings where you're like, okay.
Right. But in ancient Roman actual carving, did it have to do with in writing, would the actual letter be curved, or was it because when you're doing stonework you have to make the right angle? I mean,
yes.
Right.
So in
ancient,
the Roman alphabet only has 24 letters. That's because the V and the U are the same. And it's actually that idea is maintained, for example, in the name for maybe the fourth to last letter in the English, in our alphabet, W. W. And so because it's basically two V's together, because that was the same letter, essentially, sometimes a consonant and sometimes a vowel.
What's the story behind the mercurial symbol on the garbage trucks?
The what?
the sanitation.
Yeah,
With is it the staff with the snakes? What is it?
Yeah. Caduceus.
The caduceus. Yeah. That's a medical thing, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not
It is on the sanitation.
Sanitation.
Yeah.
Sanitation, hygiene.
Cleanliness, yeah.
What does mercury has to do with?
Does it also have to do with Asclepius, maybe?
Could be Asclepius, yeah. I wonder.
They're actually
We have
confused.
seem to have.
Yeah,
So
okay.
they're mistaken that the caduceus has something to do with sanitation and medicine. It does
Sanitation,
not.
cleanliness.
It's the rod of Asclepius, but those of us in North America don't know the difference.
So, no, these misreadings, I mean, that's what you were getting to, right? What we would call in academia misreadings, but of course they're creative, new construction,
That's the
right?
same problem
So
with the
to-
New York license plate where a doctor has a caduceus on it,
Right.
and a doctor who knows his classics would be horrified.
Well, it's really funny that you
That's so
mentioned that
funny.
because one of the things that Matt talks about in his chapter is the incorrect Latin that's on the New York Medical
Academy. The New York Academy of
So
Medicine.
apropos
Yeah,
of
right.
the problems of doctors not knowing their Latin, I feel like this is
Yeah.
you got to tell the story about
So do you know on Fifth Avenue at 103rd Street, the New York Academy of Medicine, this beautiful, strange building in...
York and Sawyer.
Exactly, yeah. I was going to say to York and Sawyer, there it is. There are no fewer than 18 Latin inscriptions on the facade, and they were the brainchild of the then president of the Academy, Charles Dana. And when they carved the title, now they had called themselves the Academia Medicinae, let's see, the Academy of Medicine, Novi Eborachensis, or Novi Eboraki at New York. The problem with this is the very where they put the name of the academy on the building, and they didn't get it right. What they've written here is the New Academy of York Medicine, essentially. Unfortunately, because this Nova goes with the Academia, and it should go with something else. And in fact, they had, as I recall now, I can't remember which one goes in which direction. See their seal. In fact, they had, if I'm not mistaken, I don't even have it here. They actually had a different way of expressing it. Oh, is that
Is
it?
it the bottom? Or no?
Yeah, here it is. Sorry, I'm in the way. Neo-Eborachensis, which is absolutely fine way of building an adjective for New York. Neo-Eborachensis Academia Medicinae. Okay? The New York Academy of Medicine, which is what it is. What they had written on the facade was the New Academy of York Medicine, or of Medicine at York, which is fine, but incorrect. And so there's this really funny epistolary exchange there in the archives among classicists at Columbia and Princeton. Fordham, we get a shout out. One of the authors says, "Why don't you just ask the priests at Fordham?" So they asked the priests at their Catholic school, and the Catholics know their Latin, or they did at that time. And they say, "Okay, well, you should call it Neo-Eborachensis Academy Medicinae." And I was so proud of the Fordham classicists that they knew how to do it. But no, these are all Princeton people. So they asked, I'm sorry if I'm offending anybody, they asked Dr. Andrew West, who was Geiger Professor of Latin and the Dean of the Graduate School, and he gave them this answer. And the folks at Columbia say, "Oh no, are you kidding? We've got this is such an embarrassment. I have some friends coming from Europe for the fair. Better change it." The horror. And so somebody says, and then the problem was, of course, solved, as it always is, by money. They said, "It's going to cost $636 to fix it. We don't have it. We're leaving it." Because they reckoned with the ignorance of the average New Yorker. And so I walk by there, I live not so far, I walk by there, I say, "Oh, if only we could remain so ignorant."
Manufacturer in 600.
Yeah, now they know. They're all, these people, it's so generous with their time, the librarian there. just really, really great. It's a great institution, really, and a world-class library for an ancient medicine. Really world-class.
So, as a way of wrapping up, because we do have a reception, so people can still continue to ask you individual questions, but well, we'll get it later. Apropos to the ignorance of the average New Yorker, you may have noticed a number of people taking notes, right, in the audience, and I know that these are New York City guides, so I think that you can feel confident that the knowledge you have imparted tonight will be spread to many, many more people.
Wonderful. Very good. All right.
So thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Who's new to the space tonight? Great, welcome. That's not very well. One so far. I recognize some familiar faces. So many of our regulars here know that we have at the museum. Did I say I'm Carol Wilson? I'm the founder, director, and curator of the museum. And we hold public programs, authors' talks, and skyscraper seminars, generally once a month, sometimes a little bit more. So this is the beginning of our 2019 series. So we're kind of starting at the beginning with classicism. But we have our focus tonight on New York, and when we do talks, we like to range broadly across topics of anything connected to skyscrapers and urbanism, or to New York City history. Next month in February, I was thinking it was either the 6th or the 7th, but it's a Wednesday night, first week in February, New York Rising. Another book that, like the one tonight, that collects essays by a number of scholars on subjects, tonight classicism and classicism in classical New York. New York Rising is about the history of real estate in New York. And indeed, the real estate history, especially the skyscraper, which is our specialty at the museum, and also the civic architecture of New York have a very strong kind of synthesis in creating the landscape of the city, the skyline, apropos of this exhibition, which is called Skyline, and looks across almost 150 years at from the very beginnings of the tall building of commercial architecture in the city to the present day, and breaks it up into periods that reflect the essential forces that shape the buildings and the collective image of the skyline, so the economic, the technological, the regulatory. And the civic landscape of New York is an important part of the subject of this book. And I see that I'm already tempted to talk too much myself tonight, but we have such an embarrassment of riches in 3 speakers, all extremely experienced in their fields and quite specialized, that I want to give them as much time as possible to present their thoughts about New York and classicism, but also to engage your questions and to talk to each other. And I'm sure I'm going to have lots of questions because I've already previewed the slides, which are a lot of fun and really do take us on quite a kind of omnibus survey of classicism in the city, far beyond Rockefeller Center in the both early times and to the present. And because I was trying to think of a way to connect the book to the subject of the series of the museum's talks, and as I read the book jacket, I thought, you can't get any better than this paragraph, so I'm just going to read the paragraph in order to describe it. The book in the Enterprise. Classical New York, this book, examines the influence of Greco-Roman thought and the design from the Greek revival in the late 18th century and early 19th centuries through the late 19th century American Renaissance and Beaux-Arts periods into the 20th century's Art Deco. At every juncture, New Yorkers looked to the classical past for knowledge and for inspiration in seeking out new ways to cultivate a civic identity, to design their buildings and monuments, and to structure their public and private spaces. And we're going to see a sampling of all of that in the slides.